Hello and welcome to Pitboards and Podiums with me, Maya Westwick. In today's episode, we are going to be talking all about the 2024 Bahrain Grand Prix, so buckle up and let's talk F1. Alright guys, so this is the first race weekend recap of the 2024 season, very exciting, and I feel like we've got a fair amount to cover. So for those of you who were not able to watch the Grand Prix or qualifying or anything like that this weekend, you're going to get all the information you need now. And for those of you who were able to watch it and just want to have a little discussion about it, hello, welcome. You are also very much welcome here. So I'm going to start off just talking about qualifying. I'm not going to talk about the practice sessions because we didn't really learn too much from them this weekend. Obviously, with it being the first race weekend of the year, we've just had testing in Bahrain as well. So the practice sessions really were just kind of like an extension of testing. We really didn't learn much new that we hadn't already kind of figured out in testing. And of course, until the qualifying sessions, we didn't really know what teams had been sandbagging and all of that sort of thing. So I'm just going to get started talking about quali. The way this is going to work, I'll talk about qualifying, I'll talk about the race itself, any like general sort of notes that I've got from the weekend, and then just anything that's worth noting post-race. Because on track, it wasn't too dramatic this weekend, but off track, a lot has been going on and a lot still is going on. And I'm going to have to cover some of it in my track guide for Saudi Arabia coming out in a couple of days as well, because there's so much going on at the moment and it's going to impact things next week as well. But I'll get into that in that podcast. So in qualifying, we saw the pace of Ferrari especially, which was lovely to see. And Q1 was topped by Carlos Sainz. He did a time of 1 minute 29.909 seconds. So we were really able to see right from the off that Red Bull potentially were not going to be as far ahead this year as they were last year, which of course is good for the sport because we all love seeing like these incredible displays of dominance, but not when it's every single race weekend and there's no competition at all. You know what I mean? So having a bit of competition in there so early on, lovely. So when Q1 started, the Ferraris and the Alpines both went out on medium tyres. They are the only cars that ran medium tyres for the entirety of the qualifying session. Everyone else went out on softs for the rest of Q1 and for the rest of qualifying in general. Gasly had his time deleted for track limits at turn 13, so his first attempt didn't count for anything. And then after the initial flying laps, so of course Ferrari on their mediums, Alpine on their mediums, and everyone else on their softs, everybody went back out for another attempt other than Carlos Sainz. So Sainz was pretty secure in his time, which of course was a 129.909. He was pretty secure in that, knowing he was going to get through to Q2. Leclerc pitted after his outlap, so he didn't actually complete another flying lap, but he did go out ready to do one, but Ferrari decided that people hadn't caught up as much as they thought they would, and that Leclerc would also be safe. Lewis Hamilton's first lap was not very good. His second attempt got him up to P10, and it was still 0.542 seconds off the pace set by Carlos Sainz. His car was not set up for qualifying in the slightest. It was run, the ride height was very low and it just seemed like it was a bit of a handful. So he did not have a very good qualifying session, but he still made it through to Q3 in the end. Stroll had a very good second flying lap, so he ended up with his second attempt at a flying lap being 0.056 seconds off of Sainz's pace. So that put him up to P2 in Q1, which of course is very, very good for him and very good for Aston Martin as well, very promising. Both of the Haas cars managed to make it through to Q2. They had Hülkenberg in P14 and Magnussen in P15. Hülkenberg was 0.657 seconds off of the pace set by Carlos Sainz, and Magnussen was 0.737 seconds off the pace set by Carlos Sainz. But considering what we were all expecting, considering what the team were expecting, and like the way that they've managed expectations before this year has started, I think all of us thought that they were going to be P19, P20, and that was all we were going to get from them. But no, that was Alpine. Alpine have had an absolute shocker. I'm going to get onto this properly a little bit later on, and just in terms of their weekend in general, but in qualifying, Esteban Ocon qualified P19 and Pierre Gasly qualified in P20. And it wasn't that anything went wrong on their laps, it wasn't that both of them had problems, it was just the car. Like, the Alpine is not a good car at the minute. On his team radio afterwards, Pierre Gasly did say that he'd had a bad outlap, but of course the pace still just wasn't there anyway, even if he'd had a good outlap. And Esteban Ocon was a little bit more positive on his team radio, saying it's only round one, we keep pushing. So I think they're motivated at the minute to sort it out and try and develop the car and try and get themselves into a good position. They're going to have a lot of work to do. They're nowhere near it right now. The other three drivers that made up the top five in Q1, not that it matters, but I just think it's interesting to note, were Verstappen in P3, Lando Norris in P4, and Fernando Alonso in P5. So that means that both of the Aston Martins are within the top five in Q1. And we also have quite a good selection of teams. You know, we've got 4 different teams in the top 5 drivers in that session. So that is very promising that we're going to have a much closer year this year in terms of race pace and qualifying pace and battles and all of that sort of thing. Hopefully it's going to be much more competitive. And also it does seem like Aston Martin have made some very good steps forward. But obviously last year at the start of the season, they looked absolutely fantastic, and then towards the end of the season just fell off. So we're just going to have to wait and see what happens with them. The 5 drivers who did not set competitive enough lap times in Q1 and therefore were not allowed through to Q2 were Valtteri Bottas, Zhou Guanyu, Logan Sargent, Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly. So that meant that they qualified with Bottas P16, Zhou P17, Sargent P18, Ocon P19 and Gasly P20. Bottas was 0.11 seconds off the pace of being able to get through to Q2. Zhou was only 0.111 seconds, so he was literally 0.001 seconds slower than his teammate. So that kind of seems that was given a good impression of the pace of the Sauber at the minute, because for both the drivers to set pretty much the same time, it seems that that's just where Sauber is at the moment, and hopefully they're going to be able to sort that out. And of course, Logan Sargent in the Williams in P18 was 0.124 seconds off of the P15 time. Q2 was topped by Charles Leclerc, so we've had one session topped by one Ferrari and then the next topped by the other. He set a time of 1 minute 29.165 seconds, which is actually the fastest lap that has been set at Bahrain since the regulation change in 2022. He was 0.209 seconds ahead of Verstappen in P2 for that session, and even after Q3, that still stands that is the fastest lap that has been set at Bahrain since the regulations changed that slowed the cars down in 2022. Magnussen had his first lap attempt deleted for track limits, which meant that he was then obviously at a more vulnerable position because he had to make his second lap count, and he was not able to find any pace really. So he ended up qualifying in P15. He was 0.407 seconds off of the pace for getting into Q3. Before Charles set his incredible time, Lando Norris set an all-purple lap, which was a 1:29.941 second time. And the closest competitive time to that at the time was Oscar Piastri, 0.683 seconds behind him. So obviously at this point, not all of the drivers have set their representative laps, and the track isn't fully rubbered in. Like, the track's going to keep evolving throughout qualifying. But that just shows you the difference as well, that Lando Norris set this lap that was all-purple and 0.7 of a second faster than his closest competitor, and he was still another 0.8 of a second slower than the eventual fastest lap in that session. It's also worth noting that Lando did that lap on old tyres. They were not brand new soft tyres, he'd already used them, and the deficit between new and old tyres was expected to be about half a second a lap. And then when Verstappen went out on new tyres, on new soft tyres, he went 0.567 seconds faster than Lando on these new tyres. So that does kind of support this, I don't want to say theory, but it just kind of support what everyone thought about the difference being about half a second. The top 5 in Q2 were, of course, Charles Leclerc, then Max Verstappen, Carlos Sainz, Lewis Hamilton, and Fernando Alonso. Hamilton set that time right at the end of the session. He was the last one to go over the line before the checkered flag. And the McLarens ended up in P9 and P10. So Lando Norris was 0.776 seconds off the pace of Leclerc, which of course was that lap that I'm saying about that at the time was topping the session. And Piastri was 0.957 seconds off of the pace. Hülkenberg in his Haas once again managed to get into Q3 with a car that we were not expecting to be able to get out of Q1. And he actually in Q2 set a time that if that had been Q3, he would have been P6 on the grid. He was only 0.686 seconds off of Leclerc's pace in the Haas, which is unbelievable. So the 5 drivers out in Q2 were Yuki Tsunoda, who was 0.007 seconds off of the pace of getting into Q3. So he was not happy about that, bless him. So he qualified in P11. And then we had Lance Stroll in P12, 0.78 seconds off the cutoff. Albon in P13, 0.099 seconds from the cutoff. Daniel Ricciardo in P14, 0.156 seconds off the cutoff. And then, as I said earlier, Kevin Magnussen in P15, 0.407 seconds off the pace. In Q3, everybody straight away, other than Fernando Alonso, went out on track. As soon as it was green light for the session, everyone was out on track other than Alonso. Verstappen set a time of 1 minute 29.421 and Leclerc was only 0.059 seconds behind that on a used set of tyres. So bearing in mind, we're thinking this whole half-second gap between new and old tyres. Very good lap from him. Russell almost lost the car on his first attempt, I think it was, at turn 6. And he said on his team radio that the ride is really, really poor. And as I said earlier, about Lewis's car, the ride was so low. They were running the car really, really low. They were also running George's car quite low. And it just seemed like the setup was not really optimised for qualifying for either of them. But I think it just wasn't optimised in general. Like it didn't seem that optimised for the race either. I don't think they got that 100% right. So with Fernando Alonso not going out for his first attempt, he then didn't go out with everyone else for their second attempts either. He was actually out of sequence with everybody and completed his only lap attempt of the session with 3 minutes to go, setting a lap time that was 0.121 seconds slower than Verstappen's first lap time, which put him at the time in P3. On their second attempts, McLaren are not able to improve their positions. They improve their times ever so slightly, but it doesn't improve their positions. So they end up qualifying at the time in P6 and P7. Lando was 0.192 seconds behind Verstappen and Piastri was 0.262 seconds behind Verstappen. They then got dropped down to P7 and P8 by the time that everyone had completed their laps. So the qualifying order for the top 10 was Max Verstappen on pole with a 129.179 second lap, which of course is still slower than Leclerc's lap was in Q2, but it's Q3 that counts for it. Charles Leclerc was then in P2, also on the front row with Verstappen. He was 0.228 seconds behind. Then we had Russell P3, 0.306 seconds behind. Sainz P4, 0.328 seconds behind. Perez P5, 0.358 seconds behind. Alonso in P6, 0.363 seconds behind. Norris P7, 0.435 seconds behind. Piastri in P8, 0.504 seconds behind. Hamilton P9, 0.531 seconds behind. And Hülkenberg in P10, 1.323 seconds behind. So by this point, you can kind of see that the Haas does not really belong there, but he's done very well to get himself there. Just some information as well, like general information from qualifying. The delta time, the same as they introduced last year, they are implementing this delta time for the safety car lines, like a maximum delta time for driving unnecessarily slowly, basically to prevent that from happening. Last year it was between safety car lines 2 and safety car line 1, and it still is, but now there's also ruling about the pit lane, because obviously last year, to get around that, people would just stop in the pit lane and hold everyone else up to build up a gap, which they are now saying they're not able to do. But of course they're not really enforcing that. Like, it still kind of happened and everyone was on the team radios questioning it, and it was just a bit of a mess. But the delta time was 1 minute and 54 seconds for the lap between safety car line 2 and safety car line 1, which is effectively between pit exit and pit entry. That was like the maximum time you could have. And the only driver that was referred to the stewards was George Russell in Q1 for driving unnecessarily slowly. And that was because he, between turns 13 and 14 down the back straight, he was getting out of the way of a lot of cars that were on their flying laps and he was not. So that was deemed no further action before qualifying even finished. But yeah, the whole thing with the driver stopping at the end of the pit lane is still an issue, even with them trying to then put it into the rules. Obviously, it's not being implemented properly at the moment, so that's something that they're going to have to look at if they want to sort that out. It's also worth knowing as well that Lando Norris already has a new energy store and control electronics in his car. Literally the first race weekend of the year, they put these new parts in, which of course comes out of his allocation for the year. And at the time of qualifying, when he was asked about it, Zach Brown said he was unsure if those parts that they'd taken out of the car would still be in Lando's pool of available components, or if he would have to take a penalty relatively early this season for exceeding the amount of parts that you're allowed. So that's something that we're going to have to look at a little bit further down the line. Moving on to the race, a couple of things to note before I start talking about the race is that in a change from the previous ruling on this, DRS is now enabled after 1 lap, not 2. So literally after the first lap of a race, after 1 lap after a safety car, all of that sort of thing, DRS is enabled rather than having to wait for a couple of laps. Straight away after 1, it's enabled. And that's been done to try and promote more racing, more close racing, to try and stop people just running away with it, I think. So we shall see throughout the season how that plays out and if that's a good change to have made or not, but it's how it is this year. And also before the race as well, everybody started the race on soft tyres. So the strategies that we were looking at was, it was going to be a 2-stop race. So the potential strategies were going to be for your first pit stop going on to hard tyres and then your second pit stop going on to softs, and just making the most of that hard tyre run, getting the most amount of laps out of it, or it was going to be onto hards and then onto hards again. So onto the race itself. Lap 1, Verstappen was ahead at turn 1. He got a relatively good start. Charles Leclerc didn't get the greatest start, so Verstappen was able to stay ahead into the first corner. There was a bit of a kerfuffle, I'll call it, between Hülkenberg and Stroll. Lance Stroll had a very good start. He started in P12 and he got himself up into the points positions going down into turn 1. And then Nico Hülkenberg, who didn't have as good a start as Lance Stroll, ended up behind him, having started in P10. So going into turn 1, Nico Hülkenberg hit the back of Lance Stroll's car, which spun him around, which meant that Stroll was down to P20. Having got himself up into the points, he was down to P20 after turn 1. Hülkenberg also was down to P19, but Hülkenberg damaged his own front wing doing that. Stroll didn't really have any damage on the car that was significant. So that meant that while Hülkenberg kind of crawled back round to the pits to get his front wing changed and have a pit stop, very, very early pit stop, obviously not the strategy they would have been going for, that Stroll was able to then overtake him and then start trying to make his way back up through the field. Bottas was also involved a little bit, so Bottas was behind Hülkenberg when it happened, and then he ended up having nowhere to go, so he appeared to have hit the back of Hülkenberg as well. But in terms of first laps, it wasn't overly dramatic. That was really the only kind of incidents that went on. On lap 2, Hülkenberg then, as I said, pits to change his front wing and changes onto the hard tyres, because of course if you've got to pit that early on, you might as well try and make the tyres last. There's no point going on to softs. On lap 3, Lando Norris passed Fernando Alonso for P6 and Piastri was all over the back of Alonso, so it was already starting to look like Aston Martin had incredible qualifying pace but not so good race pace. And also Russell passed Leclerc for P2. The Ferrari seemed to be lacking pace, which was obviously disappointing because they'd been really, really strong in qualifying in terms of pace, but it also was a problem for Leclerc that he had to manage so much. And I've seen things as well saying that for the first 20 laps of the race or so, he was losing 0.6 seconds a lap because he had an issue with his brakes. He was locking up all the time. He kept locking up his tyres going into corners and there was nothing he could do about it because basically the brakes weren't balanced properly. They had a massive differential in temperature that was going into them, and that meant that like one brake would be overheating while the other one was just functioning properly. So he'd try and brake and like one brake would not be having it. So he was just locking up the car and not having a good time, and he had to manage that for the entire race. So he drove an incredible race considering that. And I've seen a lot of things kind of not slandering him, but like definitely slagging him off because he lost positions. Like, his car didn't work and he's still finished P4. What do you mean? Anyway, by lap 4, Lando Norris was leading a DRS train down from P6 where he was all the way down to P19. The only driver that was not involved in that behind Lando Norris was Nico Hülkenberg because of course he'd had to go into the pits and have a relatively long stop. So he was in his own little world far away from the back of the pack. On lap 5, Piastri manages to pass Alonso into turn 1, and then he starts leading the DRS train after Norris breaks DRS. Norris hasn't got DRS on anyone else at this point, but nobody's got DRS on him as well, and Piastri is now leading this big fat train. And Stroll passed Bottas for P18. Russell is told to manage his tyres and back off from Verstappen. So by lap 6, there's a 4-second gap between Verstappen and Russell. On lap 7, it's the first time that we hear a change in strategy for McLaren and Lando Norris. Norris is told he's going to go on to plan B. I'm not going to go through every single one that they had on the team radio because they were doing a bit of a Ferrari, to be honest. Like, he was told plan B, and then he was told plan A-1, and then he was told this, then he was told that. Like, they were switching it up. They were changing things left, right and centre. That was the first one that we heard on the team radio. Also on lap 7, Magnussen passed Zhou for P12 and Perez passed Leclerc for P3 after Leclerc locked up right behind George Russell. It seemed like being in the dirty air of other cars was just making his problem even worse because, of course, being in the dirty air, when you run in that, your car gets hotter anyway. So having this problem with his brakes heating unevenly and then being in a situation that makes your car heat up anyway, he was not having a good time at all. He was really, really struggling up with his tyres and with locking up and with his brakes, and he was managing a lot of problems. On lap 8, Leclerc tried to pass Perez into turn 1, and Perez defended it quite, not aggressively, but almost aggressively. You know, it was some very big defending from Sergio Perez. And Magnussen and Zhou are battling for position, but Magnussen is still ahead in P12. On lap 9, Leclerc again locks up at turn 1. And on lap 10, Hamilton passes Alonso ahead of turn 1 with DRS. So it looks like Mercedes this year do have a fair bit of straight line speed. Zhou pits onto the hard tyres, comes out in P18, and Stroll pits onto the hard tyres, coming out in P19. Logan Sargent had a bit of a strange thing, and I don't really know what happened to him, to be honest. So he appeared to just massively lock up, and he kind of parked his car at the exit of turn 4. There was a yellow flag in sector 1. Everyone thought that was his race over because it took him so long to get going again. He did manage to get going again, now being down in P20. So that shows you how long he was there because Hulkenberg's got past him. And the wheel, his steering wheel, this new steering wheel that Williams have finally got, this new wheel, just said car too hot on the dash, which we saw later on for Alex Albon as well. And Alex was having problems with his wheel a little bit later on as well, which I've got in my notes and I'll talk about. Like, I don't know if it's the wheel that's the problem or if it's the car that's the problem, but there's a problem there somewhere at Williams. On lap 11, Sainz passes Leclerc and nearly makes contact with him. It was definitely not team orders. It was definitely not a planned swap. It was very much, I am getting past you, thank you very much. And Ocon pits onto the hard tyres, coming out in P18. On lap 12, Russell pits and Leclerc pits, both onto the hard tyres. Everyone goes onto the hard tyres in these first pit stops. Russell comes out in P12 and Leclerc in P14. Sargent pits, coming out in P20, almost a whole lap down. Magnussen pits onto the hard tyres again, coming out in P17. Bottas is reporting some front wing damage, probably from hitting Hulkenberg at the start of the race. And Norris is told to do the opposite of Leclerc, so when Leclerc pits, Norris stays out. On lap 13, Perez pits, coming out in P9, Piastri pits, coming out in P11, Hamilton pits, coming out in P12, Leclerc passes Bottas for P13, Gasly pits, coming out in P18, he had a very slow stop, it was not very good. Bottas then pits after Leclerc has passed him, comes out in P19, and once again we are seeing Leclerc struggling to slow the car down, especially at corners like turn 10, which is a hairpin, where you need a heavy amount of braking because it's such a tight corner. Then on lap 14, Lando Norris pits, comes out in P9, Daniel Ricciardo pits, coming out in P16, and Perez passes Russell for P6. On lap 15, Carlos Sainz pits and comes out in P7, once again behind Charles Leclerc, so Leclerc has managed to undercut him there. Sonoda pits, coming out in P11. Leclerc says on his team radio that he can't get out of front locking everywhere. It's happening every single time he tries to turn. And Hamilton also says on his team radio that he's only got 1% battery. So that was potentially looking like a problem with his ERS system, although it did seem like they were able to rectify whatever that issue was and get the battery charging again, because the battery itself, when you deploy that, that's an extra 160 brake horsepower. So that's a lot of power that he's just not able to access if the battery wasn't going to charge. On lap 16, Fernando Alonso pits coming out in P9, Alex Albon pits coming out in P14, and Zhou has managed to get up to P9 after these pit stops, bearing in mind he was one of the first people to pit. On lap 17, the Ferraris are fighting again, and I think we're going to see this a lot this year, to be quite honest. It does very much seem like since Carlos Sainz has been dropped by the team for next year, he seems like he's like, all right, well, I'll show you what you're losing. So it could get a bit spicy. And at this point, only Verstappen has not pit already. He's currently 30 seconds in the lead. So if he was to pit at this point, he has a free pit stop anyway. And also it's worth noting what I was saying about the Ferraris fighting. They were fighting the whole way around the lap. And then going into turn 1 for the next lap, Sainz literally dive bombed to pass Leclerc. Like, it was a ballsy move, I'll give him that. On lap 18, Verstappen then pits. He has a 2.9 second stop and comes out P1 with a 5 second gap to Perez in P2. Leclerc then says on his radio that every time he brakes, his car fully goes to the right, which of course is not what it should be doing. You shouldn't be having to fight the direction your car's going in just from pressing on the brakes. And Sainz passes Russell for P3. On lap 19, Ricciardo went off track quite dramatically while chasing Ocon for P15. And then on lap 20, Hamilton's battery, we've got confirmation that it is recharging, but Russell has been told not to use his overtake button and to do some derating to help the car charge the battery. So it seems like Hamilton's problem's fixed, but Russell has a problem of his own with his battery. On lap 21, Hülkenberg pits again, bearing in mind that he pitted on lap 2, onto another set of hard tyres coming out in P19, and Ricciardo passes Ocon for P15. On lap 22, Gasly has started ranting on his team radio about the car, saying that it doesn't turn, it doesn't rotate, and that it's got terrible traction, and he's just generally not very happy. On lap 23, both Mercedes are told to lift and coast to manage temperatures, despite the ambient temperature outside being literally 18 degrees Celsius. So both the Mercedes are starting to overheat. That could be something to do with the Mercedes engine. Again, this is just me speculating now, but obviously Williams are a customer team for Mercedes. They use Mercedes engine, and Williams was having problems with the car overheating. McLaren's also a Mercedes engine, and I don't remember them saying much about overheating. But if 2 out of the 3 teams using that engine are having problems with overheating, it could be something to do with the engine. It could be nothing to do with it. It's just me speculating, but it could be. On lap 25, Hamilton reports that his seat is broken, and after the race, he spoke about this, and he said that effectively, he was driving with like one bum cheek in the air because his seat cracked and just went from underneath him. So he spent another, 32 laps driving with half his bum in the air. It's the first race. Why is his seat breaking? Do you know what I mean? This is also the lap that Albon got his message on his steering wheel that I saw on the onboard of his car being too hot. I don't know if he had that at any other points, but he definitely had one then. On lap 26, Tsunoda is really chasing Zhou Guanyu down. On lap 27, Albon says that none of his dash is working because of the screen, and it seems like the team are trying to give him instructions to change the settings. His battery's at a low state of charge. Mercedes engine. And he's very much struggling with doing anything that the team is telling him to do, because every time he tries to, it is not working for him at all, which seems like it is definitely a problem with the steering wheel as well. On lap 28, Stroll pits with a 2.8 second stop, comes out in P18, 1.5 seconds ahead of Hülkenberg. On lap 29, Leclerc is told that the tyre life is longer than expected, so they're going to be extending their stint a little bit compared to their plan. Zhou pits and he comes out in P17, just ahead of Stroll. On lap 30, Sargent pits, coming out in P20, 1 minute and 31 seconds behind Hülkenberg in P19. So not only is he lapped, he's so far behind that he's almost a lap down on his nearest competitor. He's over a qualifying lap down on his nearest competitor at this point, and he's not having a good time. On lap 31, Magnussen locks up at the turn 10 hairpin. On lap 32, Bottas pits. He comes out after a very, very long pit stop. He was stationary for 52.4 seconds because of a problem with his wheel nut, which, for those of you who have been here for a while, you will know Bottas and wheel nuts are not friends. We all remember Monaco. The longest pit stop in F1 history was like 3 days. Like, he's not, I don't know what he's done to offend wheel nuts, but he's done something. So he came out in P19. So bear in mind, he has been stationary in the pits for almost a minute, let alone pit entry, pit exit. He still comes out ahead of Logan Sargent. Still. Shows you how far behind Sargent was. On that lap, also, Russell pits coming out in P9 and Gasly pits coming out in P18. On lap 33, Magnussen pits coming out in P16 and Stroll passes Zhou for P13 with a nice little DRS battle. On lap 34, Norris pits coming out in P8, Hamilton pits coming out in P9. Russell passes Alonso, so he's up to P6 with the pit stops of Lando and Hamilton happening at the same time. And Albon at this point is handling a plethora of issues in the Williams, so that's obviously something that they're going to have to work on. On lap 35, Leclerc pits coming out in P6, Piastri pits coming out in P9. As he came out of the pits, Hamilton was coming up to turn 1. They had a little battle, little switcheroo at turn 1, and with his warmer tyres, Lewis Hamilton was successful in undercutting Piastri. So Piastri tried so hard, bless him, with these fresh tyres that were cold to stay ahead of Hamilton. He just was not able to. He did not have the grip. He didn't have the heat in the tyres. So Hamilton was very, very able to get past him. And I don't know if he would have been able to if Piastri had had a better pit stop, because his front left tyre was quite slow to come off. So had his pit stop been a bit faster, he might have just been able to stay ahead, but then Lewis might have got past him later in the lap anyway. Also on lap 35, Tsunoda pitted coming out in P15. And on lap 36, Sainz pits, he had a 2.2 second stop coming out in P3. Leclerc passed Alonso going into turn 1, and Ricciardo pits having a 2.8 second stop coming out in P16 on the softs. So he is the first driver to go back onto the softs, and that is with another 21 laps of the race to go. On lap 37, Lando Norris passed Alonso for P6 and got the fastest lap so far of the race. He did not actually get fastest lap, but at that point it was the fastest lap. Also on lap 37, Perez pits coming out in P2 on the soft tyres, and Albon pits coming out in P15 on the hard tyres. On lap 38, Verstappen pits onto a brand new set of softs. He has a 2.2 second stop coming out in P1, 16 seconds ahead of Perez. Ricciardo passes Albon for P15, and then on lap 39, Hamilton passes Alonso on the main straight, and Tsunoda passes Hülkenberg for P13. On lap 40, Piastri then passes Alonso for P8. Hamilton on lap 41 says, "These guys are fast, mate," talking about the McLarens either side of him and Leclerc ahead of him as well. And Leclerc is chasing Russell down with a gap just over 1 second, so he's almost within DRS range. On lap 42, Alonso pits from P9 onto the hard tyres coming out in P11. Hülkenberg pits coming out in P18 onto the softs, and Sargent pits also onto the softs coming out in P20. Leclerc on lap 44 is now within DRS range of George Russell. On lap 46, Russell locks up into turn 10, allowing Leclerc to have the inside line into turn 11 and get past him a lot more easily and a lot earlier than he would have anticipated up to P4. On lap 40, Alonso is told that Stroll will let him past. And on lap 49, Lando Norris is complaining on his team radio that the car was undrivable. I don't really know what he was referring to because I didn't hear the whole team radio, but he was not very happy at that point about the car. On lap 51, Hülkenberg passed Ocon for P16. On lap 52 of 57, we had a bit of a joke. We had a little bit of a situation that I think was a bit ridiculous, to be honest. So the RBs, Tsunoda and Ricciardo. Tsunoda is ahead of Ricciardo. Tsunoda is chasing down points positions. He thinks he's currently fighting with Magnussen. He thinks he's still within a chance of being able to get up, past Magnussen, past Zhou, and fight Stroll for that last points position. He's drove an incredible race. He's been ahead of Ricciardo the entire race, but at their pit stops, he was put onto hard tyres and Ricciardo was put onto soft tyres, which of course are inherently faster than hard tyres. And while he is actively fighting Magnussen and trying to overtake Magnussen, Ricciardo gets a team radio telling him that they're going to do a driver swap this lap, which would put Ricciardo up to P13 and Tsunoda down to P14. Tsunoda is then told on his team radio that he needs to let Ricciardo past while he is actively fighting Magnussen. So he just replies, "Are you kidding me? Like, now? Not really the time for it." So he doesn't let him pass straight away because he is still fighting Magnussen. And he's also annoyed that mid-fight he's been told, "Let him past." Ricciardo on his team radio is then going, "Yeah, I don't need to say anything." Basically complaining about Tsunoda because he's not been let through. And when he does get let through, Tsunoda's like, yeah, thanks guys, appreciate it. And he's obviously pissed off about it. He's annoyed about it because what was the need for it? There wasn't one. It's not for a points position. Why are we letting Ricciardo pass when Tsunoda's been ahead the entire race? And Ricciardo also didn't get past anybody else. Seems a bit weird to me, to be quite honest. On the lap back to the grid as well, Tsunoda drove past Ricciardo and locked up, and they were quite close to each other, and then Ricciardo started going off about how immature he is to the media, literally in interviews saying it's Yuki, he's immature, we all know what Yuki's like, we need to let him cool down. What do you mean? Why are you talking about him like this? It's not very professional, is it? So I really don't like the picture that is being painted of Yuki Tsunoda. I really, really don't. And the whole thing I just found very strange. I didn't like it. Yuki even said on his team radio on lap 55 that Ricciardo's got to speed up, he's not fast at all. And he wasn't let back past him, and Ricciardo didn't speed up and overtake anybody else. So, a bit of a strange one. The finishing order for the race was Verstappen in P1. He had a race time of 1 hour, 31 minutes and 44.742 seconds. He got the fastest lap on lap 39 of the race with a time of 1 minute 32.608 seconds. And then Sergio Perez, his teammate, was in P2, 22.457 seconds behind. A whole 10 seconds further behind than he was last year. So that was not looking promising for us, I'll be honest. We then had Carlos Sainz making up the last podium place. He was 25.110 seconds behind Verstappen. He also got driver of the day with 31% of the vote. Charles Leclerc in P4, George Russell P5, Lando Norris P6, Lewis Hamilton P7, Oscar Piastri P8, Fernando Alonso P9, Lance Stroll P10, rounding out the points positions. Stroll finished 93.216 seconds behind Verstappen. And then everybody outside of the points was at least one lap down. So we had Zhou P11, Magnussen P12, Ricciardo P13, Tsunoda P14, Albon P15, Hülkenberg P16, Ocon P17, Gasly P18, Bottas P19, and then Sargent 2 laps down in P20. I think it's very worth mentioning that Lance Stroll managed to get up to the points again after the contact at turn 1, whereas Hülkenberg was still down in the bottom half of the field. So he did very well to recover from that, and I think that people wouldn't really recognise that necessarily a lot of the time, because a lot of people do kind of slag him off a lot and think that he's only there because his dad owns the team. So I think it's worth noting that that was a very good performance from him, actually. I've spoken about the Leclerc issue with there being the deficit between the right and left brake temperatures, throwing off the balance and just causing the car to be an absolute nightmare to handle. This race was the first time in Formula One history that every single driver has completed the season opener, which is a mad statistic. The first time in 70 plus years of the sport that every driver has finished the first race. Madness. With Alpine's poor performance, obviously qualifying P20 and P19, and then only finishing the race in P17 and 18, and the two drivers being behind them because they had their own issues in the race, obviously with Valtteri Bottas having that really long pit stop, and then with Logan Sargent just really struggling for the entire race, and obviously having the whole thing where he went off and was off for ages and all of that. It was not looking good for Alpine, and their technical director, Matt Harmon, and their head of aerodynamics, Dirk de Beer, have both reportedly resigned from the team after the Bahrain Grand Prix. So it is looking like a lot of things need to change at Alpine. A lot of people need to change by the looks of things. And there's been lots of jokes online that they're going to rock up in Saudi and the only people that work for them is literally going to be Pierre and Esteban, because people are dropping like flies. In the last 8 months, they've lost pretty much their entire leadership. At some point in the last 8 months, every position pretty much has resigned or been fired and obviously been replaced. So things are not looking good for Alpine at the moment, and hopefully they can sort it out, because otherwise all of these people that invested in them last year, obviously there was the whole Hollywood investors, all the athletes, Ryan Reynolds, all of those sort of people, they're not going to be very impressed, and then that's going to be a whole other load of issues for them, because then they're going to start losing money and it's just not going to be viable for them, and then they're not going to be able to be in the sport. So they need to sort that out. Unrelated to the race this weekend, just something that was kind of floated around the paddock was Sebastian Vettel has said that he would be happy to come back to Formula One if he was offered a drive with a top team. When that happened, Toto Wolff was like, I don't see why not. So then there started being loads of rumours that potentially Sebastian Vettel could come back to Formula One, make a return, come out of retirement and go to Mercedes. And I was very excited by that. Obviously, since then, a lot has kicked off with Red Bull, and I'm going to talk about this in the Saudi track guide episode because it's going to impact this weekend. And I obviously in my season predictions said I thought that Red Bull was going to implode. I didn't think it was going to happen this quickly. So since everything that's kicked off, which I'll talk about, the episode will be out like tomorrow, I'll talk about it in that one. But since all of that, it's looking like potentially Max Verstappen may not actually be with Red Bull for much longer. And if he was to go to Mercedes, that of course does actually mean that there's a seat at Red Bull open, which potentially Sebastian Vettel could go to. And obviously that's where he won all of his championships. But equally, with everything that's kicking off, would Red Bull still even be a good team? I don't know. It's a lot of things to consider, and it's a lot of drama that's going on at the moment that is going to impact things. This could really be a cataclysmic event in Formula One, and I think it's definitely something that is going to just keep growing and evolving, and more is going to come out because it's absolutely mad. It really is, and I'm not really sure like where we go from here. So I'm going to talk about all of that in tomorrow's episode. So that is everything that I was going to talk about from the Bahrain Grand Prix. If you enjoyed this episode, please let me know. Like, rate, comment, subscribe. Please share the podcast if you have enjoyed it. I would really appreciate that. As I said, I will have the Saudi track guide out for you tomorrow ahead of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix this weekend. Remember that this weekend it is once again on a Saturday, not on Sunday for the race. So don't miss it. And yeah, I will see you very soon. So yeah, as I said, thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it, and I will see you very soon. Bye.